After Poland fell to Hitler and Stalin in 1939, Europe was cut to pieces. Stalin and the Soviet Red Army invaded the Eastern European democracies of Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Finland. Meanwhile, Hitler and the Nazis took over the Western European countries of Denmark and Norway to, according to Hitler, protect their freedom and independence. What he really wanted was naval bases to attack Great Britain in the North Sea. The Nazis then marched on the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg and took them over quickly. Hitler's plan was now to invade France from the north and the east and bring the full brunt of the war to the Allied powers. By 1940, Europe was divided between Stalin in the east and Hitler in the west.
With the actions of Hitler and Stalin in Europe, Americans were divided on how to respond to the war. Americans who favored isolationism didn't want to aid the Allies or send American boys to fight and die in a European conflict. Americans who favored intervention wanted to send aid to the Allies and isolate the aggressors. Although FDR favored intervention, he had to listen to the American people, who strongly supported isolationism.
I hope the United States will keep out of this war. I believe that it will. And I give you assurance and reassurance that every effort of your government will be directed toward that end.
In a speech known as the Quarantine Speech, FDR promised to keep America out of the war, but isolate the aggressors, comparing them to a disease.
It seems to be unfortunately true that the epidemic of world lawlessness is spreading. And mark this well, when an epidemic of physical disease starts to spread, the community approves and joins in a quarantine of the patients in order to protect the health of the community against the spread of the disease.
Eager to aid the Allies, FDR had to appease the isolationists by signing the Neutrality Acts. The Neutrality Acts outlawed American arms sales and loans to nations at war.
Let no man or woman, thoughtlessly or falsely, talk of America sending its armies to European fields. At this moment, there is being prepared a proclamation of American neutrality.
But by June of 1940, British and French troops were being routed on the Western Front, and the Allies were in trouble. In 1940, the Germans trapped the Allied troops at the notorious beaches of Dunkirk. Then they marched on Paris, and they forced the French to surrender. The Nazis would occupy northern France, while the French would be allowed to keep a Nazi-controlled puppet government in the south, Vichy France. Eager to bring about a swift end to the war in the Western Front, Hitler turned his attention now to Great Britain. Hitler had plans to invade England, but first, he had to move to gain air supremacy against the Royal Air Force. This brings about the Battle of Britain. For 2 months, 24 hours a day, the German Luftwaffe bombed British cities and war facilities. They went to battle against the Royal Air Force, or the RAF, above the skies of England. A major symbol of British resistance and hope was Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Churchill would famously go over the radio and speak to the British people, inspiring them to hold fast, defend their nation, and stand up to the German onslaught.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
Winston Churchill would become a pivotal figure in the war. Great Britain, our closest ally and the only remaining democracy in Western Europe, stood at the edge of defeat. FDR felt enormous pressure to aid Great Britain in its fight against Germany. FDR thought if Great Britain could be aided by US supplies and win the war on its own, then the United States would not have to be forced to send American boys to die in Europe.
FDR persuaded Congress to amend the Neutrality Acts in order to aid Great Britain. The first action that Congress took was the cash and carry provision. In September of 1939, Congress allowed the Allies to buy US arms if they could pay cash and ship them on their own ships. The reason for this was to avoid US ships from being sunk, forcing the United States to enter the war. The next action they took was signing the Bases for Destroyers deal. This promised all aid short of war. FDR made a plan to give US naval ships in return for British naval bases. Aware that the United States was aiding their enemy, Germany and Italy responded by allying with Japan to form the Axis powers. This was meant to threaten the United States with a two-front war. A two-front war would make the United States have to divide their troops between the Atlantic and the Pacific. This would deplete their forces, making it more difficult to win.
In 1940, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected to an unprecedented third term as President of the United States, and he immediately begins to prepare the United States for potential entry in the war.
The people of Europe who are defending themselves do not ask us to do their fighting. They ask us for the implements of war, the planes, the tanks, the guns, the freighters, which will enable them to fight for their liberty and our security. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
Roosevelt convinced Congress to dramatically increase the defense budget and gear up for war. He also instituted the first peacetime draft in American history. Between 1940 and 1941, 1 million men were enlisted in the armed services. Roosevelt also convinced Congress to further amend the Neutrality Acts. The next step taken was the Lend-Lease Plan. With Great Britain out of cash, the Lend-Lease Act allowed the Allies to borrow arms and supplies. It was impossible for us to allow them to continue to buy arms because they were out of cash. Therefore, we simply let them borrow them, on the premise that they return them when the war is done. FDR was doing anything he could to keep Great Britain in the fight. However, the war takes a dramatic turn in June 1941, when Hitler violates his non-aggression pact with Stalin and invades the Soviet Union in the east. This opens up a new front and also changes the composition of the war. Despite opposition from some, FDR sends arms and supplies to the Soviet Union because now it has become an ally of Great Britain, as Lend-Lease is extended to Stalin.
Later in 1941, FDR secretly prepares the United States by meeting with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. They met secretly on a British destroyer off the coast of Nova Scotia. Eager to get FDR to declare war and send troops, Churchill had to settle for less. Together they signed the Atlantic Charter, which was a declaration of aims and goals for the war. In the Atlantic Charter, they pledged to correct the wrongs of World War I. They wanted collective security for the war, a disarmament of world powers, self-determination for small nations, and economic cooperation and freedom of the seas through trade. Although FDR refused to declare war, he did promise Churchill he would try to provoke Hitler into an act of war.
In January 1941, in a speech that would become known as the Four Freedoms Speech, Franklin Roosevelt outlined the hopes and visions he had for the world once the Axis powers had been defeated in the war. They were the principles that he believed America would stand and fight for if called to.
In the future days which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon four essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way. The third is freedom from want. The fourth is freedom from fear.
By the end of that year, America would be thrust into a colossal global conflict to defend those principles from annihilation and to see America's vision of a world free from tyranny come true.